Lorwyn. Chapter 14. Captain Sig's secret tributary of the Wonderwine was distractingly tranquil. The dark, wet air gave the cavern a dreamlike quality as the flamekin's flames cast flickering shadows upon the smooth, eroded cave walls and the other people aboard the Merrow's shape-water ferry. In fact, the only light here issued from living sources. Thin lines of glowing moss and patchy mats of luminescent fungus on the cavern walls, Ashling's living flame, and the fairy trio's own cascading ribbons of sparkling colour. Ileana, yet unnoticed, took stock. The tributary's currents were gentle, and there was even a breeze, cool and soothing, despite its brackish, sour scent. The sound of the waves lapping up against the semi-solid craft's outer edges was like a lullaby to the party, whose ears had been too full lately with the sounds of strife and conflict. Sig was also a calming influence. His cheerful patter was familiar and reassuring, and he steered the shapewater craft with such confidence that it was easy to relax. Easy to imagine that no one could ever disturb the surety of this placid journey. Kinsale was far away, along with all the dangers and mysteries it contained. As the town fell farther and farther behind, it was easy for the others to imagine their troubles growing more distant right along with it. Aisling asked Sig why the Merrow was sure this shortcut made them safe from pursuit by the elves. His answer, delivered in the same cheerful tone he used to deliver a bawdy limerick, seemed to unsettle the flamekin. Because the Merrow call these the dark tributaries. Why did they call them that? Aisling pressed. Because they're dark, Sig replied, and dark water can hide terrible things. Many of these caves are connected, and even a Merrow can get lost. That fungus doesn't grow everywhere. Most Merrow who enter the tributaries without proper preparation are never seen again, and if they are, they're different. He had flattened his forecrest and lifted his shoulder fins in a Merrow shrug. I was lost down there once, and I was lucky enough to find a way out before anything too horrid happened along. Later I came back and worked out a few safe routes, ones with enough illumination to get a ferry through to the other side. Do these horrid things you mentioned stay away from the light? Marilyn asked. Oh no, Sig laughed. But they're slow, and can be avoided if you see 'em coming. He flashed a toothy smile. My shapewater doesn't run into things unless I tell it to. Their doubt lingered, but as time passed and the lazy passage continued, Ileana felt the group's doubt shrink. The group was too tired to take on another challenge, even if it was the simple question of how Sig did what he did. The shapewater craft was large enough for everyone to have some privacy as they faced outwards. A small measure of time and space away from the others. Bridget, Reese, and Aisling each took this opportunity in different ways. As the hours ticked by, everyone on board managed to perform certain small yet significant actions that none of the others could see or would ever understand. Or so they thought, Ileana giggled to herself. Bridget busied herself with inspecting her equipment, checking each arrow tip for keenness, and each shaft for balance. After that was complete, she set about organizing them so that the sharpest and straightest were within the easiest reach. While Aisling and Reese were on the opposite side of the craft and Marilyn was absorbed in views of the glittering caverns, Bridget also performed several small ritual castings. All Kifkin were adept at augury. Some simply forecasted tomorrow's wind and weather, and others practiced a grander, more sweeping kind of prognostication that involved the great spirit elementals themselves. Bridget's totems and fetishes were basic and unspectacular. Perhaps she was trying to gauge the river's flow and speed. Maybe she was seeking guidance or reassurance regarding the fate of Kinsale under Nath. The archer had been dour, even prickly since the Guiltleaf elves had descended on her village. She muttered something about how she ought to have stayed to help her fellow Kifkin, but then she loudly claimed helping Rhys fell under her original duty to the Sen, in furtherance of Teague's lifelong awe and respect for Culfanor. She also allowed that helping Rhys escape might draw Nath and his pack away from Kinsbale entirely, but of those few passengers who had a spare thought for the Kifkin's reasoning, none of them fully believed her, not even Bridget herself. Marilyn was almost fully recovered from her injuries, but she was no more outgoing than the archer. The stranger claimed to be exhausted and overwhelmed. Her oddly shaped face went slack as her eyes fluttered closed. If she was telling the whole truth about her time spent lost in the forest, this was the first time she had not slept wild in quite some time. But after her eyes had been closed long enough for everyone to stop paying attention, Marilyn's fingers tapped out an almost inaudible tattoo on the Shapewater's smooth surface. It was no more than a nervous habit, perhaps absent-minded fidgeting, but there was something calculated and measured about her movements, especially for one who seemed to be fast asleep. Rhys eventually sequestered himself and sat cross-legged in deep meditation for over an hour. The words that formed soundlessly on his lips were not recognizably Elvish, but he was a pupil of a treefolk sage, and who knew what languages he spoke to himself? Likewise, Aisling crouched with her eyes closed in silent contemplation. If not for the constant fluctuation of the colour and intensity of her flames, one might have assumed that she was simply resting. Ileona floated up near the cavern's ceiling. Visa and Endry joined her, and the siblings spoke in gentle whispers. "Time for a treasure hunt," Ileona said, and the twins nodded, for once holding their tongues. "Visa, you take the archer. Endry, you get the stranger. I'll see what that elf and the flamekin have to offer. If Sig pokes his nose up, push him back under." She gestured down at the others on the craft. "They're all quiet now, lost in their own thoughts. It should be easy to find out what they're really thinking." Visa smiled and beat her wings, releasing a small shower of colourful dust. "Let's make a game of it. Last one to harvest a bit of dream stuff is the loser. You're on." Ileona smiled. "Count me in, but to make it completely fair, let's put everyone to sleep at the same time." The three nodded in unison, and then Ileona said, "Off you go now." The twins quietly fluttered down to the water's edge and circled around to the rear of the Shapewater craft. Visa towards the archer, and Ileona towards the stranger. There was nothing stealthier than a fairy looking to avoid notice, and soon each of the trio was close enough to weave their sleeping spells without altering the others at all. The slumber song emerged from Ileona's mind as a soft, echoing sound that was quickly picked up and enriched by her siblings. Like a swarm of liquid bees, magic swirled from the siblings, flowing and eddying between them before stretching out on each side of the moving Shapewater craft, creeping towards its passengers. The smoky essence caught and reflected the dim, bluish light from the cave walls, casting an azure sheen over the entire deck. No audible voice could ever match the silent song's fragile beauty. To the ears and minds of all non-fairies, it was an irresistible push towards unconsciousness, much the same as a waking person's desperate urge to remain within their favourite dream, rather than abandon it and see what that awful noise outside was. The world of dreams was so warm and safe and comforting. Who could resist its call? With the spell complete and actively affecting the party, Endry, Visa, and Ileona hovered over their slumbering targets. One by one, the trio each drew gleaming knives that glinted silver-white in the strange light of the cavern. They alit on the sleeping others on shoulders and breastbones, their wings keeping them all but weightless. The fairies held knives to the throats of their companions, turned their faces to each other and nodded. A galvanic crackle sizzled through the air, and the siblings' minds connected through the skein of dream stuff and fairy magic. Ileona knew they'd have to harvest quickly now that the game was on. She could count on the twins to play quietly for a while, but Visa and Endri would quickly grow bored. Ileona sighed under the awful burden of responsibility. It was not her fault she had been first to awaken when the trio was born. Only a few seconds had passed before Visa had emerged, but in those seconds Una, the Great Mother, had spoken to Ileona. "Welcome to the world," Una's voice had intoned, nowhere and everywhere. "You don't have long. None of us do. Be sure to make the most of it. Your name is Ileona, little one. Stretch your wings now. I must greet your siblings and give them their names." The hard distinctions between the siblings shattered once Endri woke, received his name, and rose into the sky. 3 fairy bodies and 3 fairy minds slipped into perfect coordination, parts of a unified whole, and they drank deeply from the love and magic that Una offered. In less than a day, they were ready to leave the Great Mother and venture out into Lorwyn to do her will and enjoy life to its fullest. As the sleeping spell thickened over the Shapewater craft, Ileona felt her own conscious mind vanishing, trickling away like the melting snow in the crags. This void quickly filled to bursting with the combined perspective of her siblings, and the other passengers. It was a heady, wholesome rush of thoughts and sensations as broad and strong as the Wonderwine after a 10-day rain. Bridget's sleep was like that of a big forest cat or a soldier on maneuvers, light, fragile, and easily disrupted. Visa did herself proud, holding the dagger steady without breaking the skin, as their magic wormed its way into the Kifkin's mind. Bridget hadn't been casting for augury or divination earlier. She had been sending a message to... whom? Senteague? The treefolk? It would take more digging to find out. In the meantime, Bridget's mind had a clear picture of what she had done. Bridget's body had hidden her work from the others. The archer had combined a rusty arrowhead, a scrap of paper, and a lock of yellow hair in a small wooden box. She had whispered a word, and then, after a jagged slash of light singed the bottom of the box, a tiny glittering moth had fluttered up. It was grey-white and luminous, but its pale glow vanished against the soft light from the cave walls. Bridget had watched the moth flutter away from the ship, back up the cavern the way they'd come, until it was no more than another glittering reflection from the walls and water. Visa would be hard to beat in this game, Ileona realized. Secrets were always the most highly prized bit of dream stuff, and Bridget's actions were tantalizing in their simplicity. It was a minor spell, capable of delivering a minor message. But what was that message? To whom was it addressed? If Visa teased that information from the archer, she'd flog her siblings with victory for weeks. Nettled by the strength of Visa's find, Ileona focused harder on recent Ashling. It would do no good to complain about having twice as many people to sift through. Her siblings would simply see that as twice as many chances to glean something good. Ileona would have to work quickly and hope for the best. Ashling's intensity about the elemental was not just due to her growing interest in Reese. Lately she had been feeling the elemental's presence with increasing force, but always just ahead, always just out of sight and out of reach. Even in Ashling's deepest thoughts, she did not dare to imagine what shape it had, what powers it could confer upon her. But she longed to find out so strongly that it almost eclipsed every other thought in her head. She dreamed and daydreamed about it, seeing herself and her path clearly, but only the spot she was on and the few clear feet beyond. Something was just beyond her vision, known to her only as a shapeless, indistinct thing. Whatever it was, it beckoned to her via all her senses. Sound, taste, smell, sight, and touch, it drew her to it, calling her on. But just as someone trapped in a glass maze can't see the torch that marks the exit, Aisling knew where she wanted to go, but not how to get there. Rhys's dream stuff was similarly focused but nowhere near as interesting. His body had the tinge of glamour around it, but his mind was a tightly organized thing. A stack of leaves arranged so that each tip and each stem stood in perfect alignment with those above and below. Ileana knew that she could flip through these leaves, rifle through them in the hopes of spotting something juicy, but she did not have the time, not if she wanted to do so without alerting Rhys. Annoyed, Ileana withdrew from the pair and cast her hopes on Endry. She didn't want the youngest of the twins to win the game either, but Endry was easily distracted and too in love with the new novel. He was half as likely to boast as Visa, half as much, and for half as long. To Ileana's surprise, Endry had acquired none of Marilyn's dream stuff. Was the stranger's secret so fabulous that Endry had abandoned the game to keep it for himself? That would be most unfair of him. Ileana was about to tweak Endry for an answer when the youngest sibling's voice stabbed out, calm but cold and deadly serious. "The game's over," Endry said, sounding more urgent and focused than Ileana could remember. It was an unfamiliar, even uncomfortable sensation to have the youngest and most frivolous of their clique sound so dire. "You both need to see this right away." "What is it?" Visa's voice whispered. "Shh," Andrew replied. "You just don't want to lose. I said shush. Now follow me." Ileana focused on Endry's point of view, made the sights and sounds and thoughts in her brother's head foremost in her own. Endry had indeed infiltrated Marilyn's sleeping mind, but what she found there was impossible, unacceptable, and inconceivable to one of Una's many children. Marilyn's thoughts were like a great dark sphere, featureless and impenetrable. It was not the absence of a dreamscape, but rather a very large and well-protected fortress, a round, dense monolith that had so far proven impervious to fairy magic. "What is that?" Visa said, her voice soft with wonder. "Told you," Endry said. Ileana started to answer. "We must inform the—" "Even in dreams you can't stop babbling." Marilyn's voice was calm and even, but it was so loud it drowned out the slumber song and the fairies' shared thoughts. "I can't say I'm surprised or disappointed, only amazed. How do you ever accomplish anything the way you distract each other? So you're spying on me, little bugs, crawling around my thoughts like wasps on a window pane. I was willing to tolerate your behavior in the world, but in my head is another matter entirely. This is a rudeness I can't overlook." "What are you going to do about it?" Endry said, his voice rising. "Yeah," Visa said. "You can't get mad at us for snooping. We're fairies." Ileana fought back her reflexive urge to add her own voice to the discussion. Gently, so as not to disturb the others, she unmade the larger part of the sleeping spell, calling the magic that powered it back into the bodies of her clique. She left enough of the song in place to make sure Rhys and the others remained unconscious, because she didn't want them demanding an explanation before she had time to think one up. But the largest share of the magic they had woven was hers to reshape any way she liked. Ileana's vision shimmered, and she found herself hovering near the front of the shapewater saucer. She buzzed along its edge, homing in on Endry and the stranger, knowing that Visa was doing the same. Endry had backed away from Marilyn, who stood wide awake, her arms casually crossed over her chest. She was not smiling, but there was an amused quality to her posture. Her dark eyes were fixed on Endry as Ileana and Visa joined their sibling. "What are you?" Ileana said. "You really don't know," Marilyn said, amused, and cocked her head to one side. "I am what I am, a lost and lonely traveller." "And I'm a giant's codpiece," Visa replied. Ileana hovered closer. What magic are you using? She lashed the air with her sharp, tubular tongue. It tastes familiar. Magic? Marilyn dramatically placed the tips of her fingers over her mouth. Surely no magic is greater than the dream spells of the Fae. I think it's time for you to... What's the word, Visa? Drown. Die. Disembark, Ileana said. She spread her wings wide and buzzed them menacingly as she drifted towards the stranger. Her siblings instantly joined in on either side. I hope you can swim. You were only ever dead weight to begin with. All ashore that's going ashore. You're going to kill me. Marilyn propped a clenched fist on her hip. Throw me overboard before you've gotten any answers. I thought Fae were curious folk. Curious, Ileana said. Not stupid. Marilyn only appeared to be standing still and smirking, but Ileana recognized real danger behind that careless demeanor. The stranger was waiting for them to cast a spell on her, eager for it, in fact. Ileana decided to change tactics. Everyone assumed fairies were insubstantial creatures, mischievous tricksters who trafficked in games and glamours, little more than colourful pests, really. Ileana smiled. Endry especially loved shattering that particular illusion, and in that respect, like so many others, the three siblings were of one mind. Get her, Ileana shouted, and they rushed forward in perfect coordination. Ileana went towards Marilyn's face while Visa and Endry each curved around behind. They left dusty trails of colour in their wake, trails that bent and swung into a triangle that completely surrounded Marilyn. The boundary thickened and hardened into solid bars of smoke and light. Up, Ileana said. The fairy siblings rose higher into the air, towing their triangular shape up with them. At its center, Marilyn's feet rose off the deck. The stranger was suspended and held fast within her magical enclosure. She did not seem troubled at all by her predicament, but rather continued to smile sharply with her head cocked to one side. Her dark eyes darted back and forth between the siblings. But otherwise, Marilyn was utterly still and placid. Well, she said, you've got me, though I dare say you don't know what you've got. Now what are you going to do? The twins giggled and chattered. Una! Bring her to Una! The mention of the Great Mother's name drew a flicker of concern, recognition, both, emboldened. Ileana cried out, Hold on tight. If we don't mess this up, we'll be the first in 100 generations to show the Great Mother something she hasn't ever seen before. And then we'll be rewarded. Una doesn't know it yet, oddball, but she can't wait to meet you. Marilyn's head straightened, but her smile remained unchanged. I'm looking forward to seeing her too. Fairy wings sent a waft of dank air against the cavern walls as Ileana, Visa, and Endry guided their strange cargo away from the shape-water craft, moving against the river's flow as they disappeared in the dim, flickering lights of the cavern. Aisling awoke, disorientated and confused. She grappled with foggy memories. When had she drifted off? How had she drifted off? She heard angry voices coming from the rear of the shapewater, and she noticed that they were drifting, floating along no faster than the river's lazy current. She isolated Sig's voice from the others and knew that something had gone wrong. Aisling rose to her feet, privately swearing that she would never travel by water again, at least not with Sig, who seemed to be a magnet for maritime disasters. She moved quickly towards the angry voices and found Rhys, Bridget, and Sig firing hard looks and sharp words at each other. I couldn't do anything, Sig was saying. The Merrow's upper body bobbed on the water alongside the shapewater craft, and he thrashed his tail to keep his face level with the others. 1 minute I'm piloting along no problem with everyone on board and accounted for. The next minute I turn around and see the fairies absconding with your companion. I tried to slow down and call after them, but I couldn't. It was like watching a mural move. I've never seen a Merrow lose control over his shapewater passengers, Rhys said. What happened? I'm not sure I take your meaning, Sig said sullenly, but I don't think I like it. Are you saying that I'm at fault? That I let this happen? Or that I profited from it? You tell me, Captain. If you blacked out somehow, why didn't we all drop into the river? I don't know, Sig objected, clearly frustrated. I'll tell you, I've had dealings with those three before. I don't know how many fairy clients you've had to deal with out there in the woods, but let me tell you something, my son. Only a fool thinks he's in control when fairies are involved. Do we really need them? Bridget said. Any of them. I mean, we're better off without them, aren't we? Aisling did not like the uncomfortable silence that followed the archer's words. It was too much like agreement by default. We cannot leave Marilyn to them, the Flamekin said. They've made their opinions on her clear. So they don't like her, Bridget said. So what? They're not likely to kill her. They'll probably just strand her somewhere, leave her in the woods with no memory of the past few days, naked but for a pair of funny shoes. Wherever she turns up, Marilyn's arrival will be the stuff of story legends in that village for years. We should go after her, Aisling said. We should turn around. Not a good idea, Sig shook his head. Maybe not even possible. It's certainly not desirable, not from where I'm swimming. We're almost to the end of the dark tributaries, miss. The grove is not far from here. Aisling turned to Rhys. You want to go after her, she said. I know you do. You can't rescue her from the woods, and then save her from the elves, only to let the fairies have her. She recalled what Rhys had told her about the great elk spirit, how it had seemed to stand in judgment of Rhys for what he had done. Your path is nobler than that. Rhys bared his clenched teeth. Don't lecture me, he said. He looked back down the cavern, then to Aisling, then to the river ahead. How hard would it be to track them? Considering they can fly, impossible, Bridget said. Harder than I care to work, and for less reward, agreed Sig. Aisling felt deflated, in part by Rhys's words and in part by the satisfied reactions they drew from Bridget and Sig. Then the gloom inside the cavern grew thicker and more oppressive. Aisling thought for a moment that she was falling asleep once more, but as the world around her dissolved into darkness, she felt a yearning, a powerful hunger that called from every direction. She heard the distant thunder of massive hooves pounding the soil, smelled the scent of burning applewood and cedar, felt the world shift below her, not as shapewater shifts with the current, but more as a saddle shift between rider and steed at full gallop. Against the endless darkness, Aisling saw a flash of fiery mane and a glimmer of ghostly white. It was coming towards them, racing down the cavern from a direction they'd come. She stared, wide-eyed, though she was unable to hold any details about the presence for more than a fleeting second. She felt it sweep by the ferry and surge on down the river towards the approaching end of the cavern. Sail on, Rhys said to Sig. Neither he nor the others had reacted to the fiery apparition. As fast as you can, Captain. He faced Aisling and said, This is turning out to be an especially busy stretch of your path, Pilgrim. If you accompany me to the grove now and help me see my mission through, I would like to retain your services again in the search for Marilyn. Aisling's mind cleared. The cavern returned to her sight, along with the shapewater disc, its captain, and all the remaining passengers. She almost wept with joy. She had her sign at last. The Flamekin's light flared, and she hid her triumphant smile under the broad brim of her iron hat. Very well, she said solemnly, but I will hold you to that. Sig nodded, and slipped below the surface of the water. Bridget slung her bow over her shoulder and followed Rhys to the front of the craft. Both warriors were intent on spotting the cavern exit as soon as it appeared. Aisling stood for a moment, trembling with excitement as the sound and sensation of those thundering hooves still resonated inside of her. Then she followed the others and stood beside them. Each was alone and silent, thinking their private thoughts.